Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This video is about authentication. More specifically, I want a user to be able to register in any of my front-end applications and log in to any of my front-end applications with the same user account, so the same credentials. For that, I quickly made I made a scheme in Draw.io about the current setup, at least with the runnable projects. So the SP8 projects, the circles are the Blazor WebAssembly projects, front-end projects. Then we have both APIs and both workers and both databases. These underneath. How it's currently set up is both databases have their own user tables, which is not ideal. That would mean um, if a user logs into or registers in one app only, that account will only live in one of the databases. And let's say the user registered in both applications, still the user accounts won't be exactly the same, since at least the refresh tokens will be different and all that such complications will occur. I want to achieve that user being able to log into all the applications without any backends crossing boundaries or anything. So what I wouldn't do is the API, then for example, also posting the user account to this database or something, or syncing the databases, or communicating, making these two APIs communicate could be possible. Let's say Pet Social API then posts to Pet Adopt API, but that's all stuff I don't want to do. Since you're always going to end up with some kind of duplication, you'll probably have to keep those accounts in sync and then decide which is the most recent version and all that stuff. I'm not going to do all of that, so I want to keep my boundaries clear, and so nothing should cross them. At least nothing in the backend should cross the boundaries. To avoid duplication, the solution is quite obvious, I would say, and that is to add another database where the user accounts will live. And make sure, of course, the user accounts are no longer the responsibility of either of these databases or APIs. That would look something like that. Now, anything related to authentication or authorization would be handled by this authentication API, auth API, which checks against its own database that has the user tables and just one, how do you say it, one source of truth. Sorry for the pronunciation. One source of truth. I can't pronounce it. Anyway, so the user flow would be something like a user registers an account with this front-end application. This app would do an HTTP call to the auth API. To create the user account, indeed. At this point, the user account is not activated yet, so this auth API sends an email after it created the user account, of course. Sends an email to the user, so with a link to activate the account. That link would then go back to the auth API. Auth API would activate the user account and ideally redirect the user back to this login page where the user can log in using the credentials. So that's sent over HTTP to the auth API. Auth API should return a GWT token for the user to authorize further requests to access other resources afterwards. So in an authenticated user, what I like to do then is keep a user profile, which is something else that just holds the user ID and some specific user settings or preferences related to that application. So for the Pet Social SPA, that would be, for example, the user wants to see dog barks, but only the private ones. So that setting or preference or filter could be saved in the Pet Social database. This is a setting that's not important to this entire application. That's why I would keep a separate user profile with only such information. And then let's say the user, at this point, the user should be authenticated and have like the GWT token or refresh token in the local storage. So if that user would then navigate to the pet adopt SPA, the user would already be logged in, might not yet have a user profile. So in that case, I'll create a user profile for that user, only of course for an authenticated user. I stress that because not anyone entering some credentials should result in creating a user profile, of course, only one that is actually authenticated. And a user profile would be created for settings specific to this application. The setting specific to this application would be I want to see dogs with only the dog breed of an American Staffordshire Terrier, for example. I think that's a viable solution. I have an alternative solution, but one that is a little more complex. It was actually my first solution that came to mind before I thought this through. So in this case, that would work, everything I just said, for the user flow at least, simply because the user does an interaction with the email to activate the account, and that link could have some kind of redirect URL back to where the user came from. So that's an advantage that we have that user interaction to redirect back. If we didn't have that, we would probably have to you publish a message or something saying, oh, the account got created, uh, and then only then create a user profile in these databases ready for the user to save his or her settings to. Let's check out the alternative solution. That would be something like this, a bit more complex since it uses a message queue. So let's start here. User registers, goes to the auth API. Auth API creates the user account, which is not yet activated, but on successful creation, it should send an email to the user. The user could then click the email. I put it here. The user could then click the email. The activation email goes to the API. The API attempts to activate the account. When successful, it would publish an event with that user ID at least. Maybe publish two events, one for each worker to process. So let's say two messages with the user ID and with a type. The type would then be, for example, the name of which worker should process it. Just an example. And these, if they successfully process the message, would then create a user profile for that user ID with that linked to that user ID. Okay, so that would be an alternative solution. This is, since we also already saw the first solution, I'm not going to do this one since it's not needed. I could be wrong. Maybe you would think this is a better solution than the first one. I'm open to discuss that in the comments. So let's say this user interaction wasn't there. So I have an example for that. Then this would probably be the only solution that I can think of. So let's see about that. It's not about authentication, but it's about payments. So let's say a user does an in-app purchase. The flow would be, click submit on some kind of form where you want to enter the amount you pay or whatever the product. That would redirect you out of the app and to a, no, let me rephrase. The user clicks on a product to purchase, that would send a HTTP call to the payments API to create a a payment record in the database with the status of open or pending or something like that. But then we should be redirected out of, we should be redirected to some kind of checkout URL, to something from an external service like Stripe or Molly or something like that, where the user sees a QR code to scan or something to pay with the bank app. And then when that payment was successfully processed, that service will call our API with an update saying whether the payment got cancelled or completed. And then we can, so that does normally that does like a post, like a webhook post to our API, to an endpoint we specify actually. And this will process that message, that HTTP post, and update the already created payment entry with just update the status to paid or cancelled or whatever. At that point, we should probably create an order in either of these databases. An order or something else. In my specific use case, it's called a spotlight. Let's quickly go over that. So on the live version of my app, you can do in-app purchases. If you click on a dog, a shelter dog, click on the spotlight button, click on spotlight, then it redirects you to some kind of external service. Then you can pay, and then you scan the QR code, and when that successfully happened, or if I just close it, it should, yeah, that's what I explained. But in this scenario, so at this point, the dog is then in the spotlight, enjoys the spotlight for 48 hours. That means it would be, the dog would be visible in here, like highlighted, and also in the front pages everywhere. But that means its spotlight record should be saved in the pet-adopt database. And now we can't really, yeah, there's no user interaction anymore. So the last interaction that happened was from the external service doing an HTTP post call to our payments API. So actually now either this payments API should directly update the pet-adopt database, but we're not going to cross that boundary. We're not going to have any other API than its own API access this database. Or this API could post to this API and then could be something. I'm not going to cross these boundaries. So a solution would be to implement a message queue. So then this payments API would publish a message with the transaction information at least. And maybe again the type of worker that should process this message. And then hopefully it successfully gets processed by this worker, which subscribes to the message broker, of course. And this should then create that spotlight record. That would be a pretty feasible solution. It's a bit more complex. I'm not yet sure which message queue I'm gonna use. Maybe RabbitMQ. I'm gonna do some research for those things, or maybe something I can easily leverage on Azure. The service bus or something. I'm not sure yet. So that's for a future video. So let's get back to our authentication, which is the subject of this video, to separate this out of the current application. I already did it behind the scenes because I didn't want to bore you with all of the refactoring and all that stuff. all the authentication features used to live in the shared features, and the entities, the database entities used to live in the shared database, and the controllers for authentication used to live in the shared API. So that was pretty easy to drag that out. And I dragged that out into the utils project. Why utils and not auth? Because there was more than just auth in there in these shared projects. So now if we take a look at the API, we have auth, contact, files, metrics, and transactions. These are all almost standalone features, if I can say it like that. The contact and the files one don't use the database, so yeah, that's not too. It's just the metrics, the transactions, and the auth. So you'll see the database entities are mainly metric, refresh token, transaction metadata, and then all the identity framework stuff happens on this. I extracted that to this utils DB context. So it's using the identity DB context, and oops, let's see the seeding line. I should comment it out. And it has its own database provided, a SQL Server database, and the identity configuration. And something else, then the features are just auth, metrics, and transaction. So all the auth commands are in here. That was very easy to just extract all of those out to this new project, since they were already kind of extracted out. All the projects, since we're using Mediator, that's all very easy to do, loosely coupled. The clear, yeah, no dependencies going all over the place, so it was easy to clear hierarchy and dependency flow. That's the kind of the point of using the clean architecture template of Jason Taylor. Is that, yeah, let me quickly show you Taylor clean architecture. It's kind of to have this, which domain is actually the top one, depends on nothing. Application depends on domain. Presentation is the HTTP API, web APIs, for example. And the worker services, they depend on the business application is the business logic. And then infrastructure is more like the databases, and more than just the databases. Depend on the business logic. So you kind of get it. The advantages of that is to have a good, a well-structured code base. It's testable. 90% independent of database, because the interfaces contain the DB sets of entity framework. But yeah, but the way Jason Taylor did it, it's even more independent than what I did. But I inspired my solution on his template, at least. Dependent frameworks, yeah, that's he means the business logic is extracted from the .NET Core web APIs, so that the business application is no longer depending on whether this project is a web API or a background worker or a a console application or whatever. Um, what I did, since I don't see myself switching from Entity Framework anytime soon, like my feature layers. So features for me, that's the business application layer, actually, the business logic, I'm sorry, application layer. They do depend on the database layer, so the so-called infrastructure layer. I have these external libraries that depend on nothing, but every project can depend on that, like reference it. So that would actually also be part of the infrastructure layer. Yeah, although it's usually only the presentation layers that depend on these, since just some kind of controller will call one of these yeah, methods and these libraries. It's not going to be actually, you're not going to see a feature like the actual business logic suddenly call one of these, I think. Those would be rather orchestrated in the controller. Anyway, it's not the point of the video to go to dive into that. It's very interesting, all these clean architecture, clean code, all those subjects. Jason Taylor, very wise man to follow. I think you have others, Steve Ardalis. I haven't seen much of him. And then you have, with someone I like a lot, Code Opinion. It's a YouTuber. It's actually Derek Comartin, if I'm not mistaken. On codeopinion.com. Yeah, you see him here in the videos. Also has very interesting videos about boundaries, context, how to structure, and how to, like in this example, how to use message queues, to avoid coupling between like direct coupling. So to use asynchronous solutions for that. Yeah, very interesting. So as I was saying, this project now has its own database containing the user tables and all that stuff. So let me run this one. If the database is running, I have it here. Oop. Was a bit late with that. Yep. And then I have the utils API with all the auth endpoints, the contact endpoints, the files, metrics, and transactions. We'll see how this evolves. It could be that all these move out to their own dedicated API once, or a microservice even, but I'm not going to do that before I need it. Also, every API you spin up on Azure is going to cost you about $5 or something a month. So I'm not in a rush to do that. And the way our project is set up, if it's ever needed, we can just easily move these pieces out. That's not a problem. So what it used to be is that all these endpoints got duplicated in both the Pet Adopt project and the Pet Social project. And so they were kind of storing their own user accounts and their own transactions and all that stuff. That's not really ideal to have multiple sources of truth, so to speak. It's better to just have one, I would say. Also, the way we set this up, so thanks to Jason Taylor, of course. Jason Taylor was already advising to limit the dependency on identity framework. an entity framework, if I'm not mistaken. So a thing he did, I think you can still see it in his templates, is he doesn't really use the identity user directly, or at least doesn't never references it or doesn't create any relations to it, because he doesn't want to have that identity framework dependency all over the project. Not in the business logic, at least not in the and the same for the entity framework dependency. He aims to keep that out of the so to keep the business logic independent of, what did he say? To keep the business logic independent of frameworks. Yep. So that's entity framework, identity framework, or even just .NET Core or whatever. Okay. So if we take a look at the entity, and of course, we don't have an entity for the identity user. But if we take a look at the refresh token, just has a string linked user ID, not like identity, not like identity user or something, which maybe in this project wouldn't be a problem, but it would be a problem if that was the case in the entities of a specific project. Let's say user profile just has a string user ID. And you see I have some extra info that's mainly a copy of the email, username, and telephone number, phone number. I'm probably going to leave that out and just call the new API, the utils API, if I need that information. I'll probably have to compose my UIs in the front end a bit, so to have data from this API and then data from, for example, the preferences from this API and so forth. I hope it was somewhat clear. At least now these projects no longer have the responsibility of authentication or user management or any of that. Their responsibility is really what the app is meant for. So adopting dogs, and this one is, dog parks and all that stuff, events, social stuff. The reason, of course, I this pet social stuff used to be in this pet adopt project, like a long time ago. I had this application, which was my first application in Blazor. It's originated 2 years ago now, I think. And this one had like extra menu items for dog parks and the events, dog related events, like meetups and all that stuff, and things that actually didn't really make sense to have in this application, since this is really like more targeted to people that don't have a dog yet and are looking for a dog, not like, you can't say like, oh, you don't have a dog yet, oh, here's a dog park, like that makes no sense, or something like that. So I separated those out. um, yeah because what's the right wording for it? Yeah, just wasn't this application's purpose to like this application's focus is really adopting dogs and finding the shelter and all, contacting the shelter and all that stuff. So nothing outside of that. So the pet social one is more like, let's see. This is one of the apps I made, and then you see the dog events and all that stuff. So that's events, dog parks, dog hotels, like pension. I don't know if that's the English translation. So more and services and shops. So assuming this is like more for people that already have a dog and are interested in social gatherings and all that stuff, or services for their dogs or products for their dogs. So, and then I have I don't know why I'm showing all of this actually. This Leisure website is kind of a promotes the different apps I've built. So the dog adoption app, and then the Belgian Doggos app you just saw, and the list will get longer in time. And this also displays the events and the dog parks and the services. But now I also want to display the shelters and the dog breeds and the dogs, the adoptable dogs. So that's why I have Belgian Doggos and Pet Social SPA accessing the Pet Social API, but Leisure accesses both Pet Adopt API and Pet Social API. We'll probably also access the Auth API, which in our code base is called Utils API right now, but never mind that. And it's even possible that the Belgian Doggos SPA will also show the shelters, the dog shelters, and some of the adoptable dogs per shelter. So actually components from this application. But the Pet Social SPA won't. That's just that's an application I made for someone else who is so active in organizing dog events and all that stuff, but also active in a specific shelter. So for that reason, the crossover. And that's basically why I made these extra Razor class libraries. So you have a shared SPA at the top, which basically holds all the CSS and some of the more generic components, template components, cards, models, all that stuff. And then the shared SPA is specific with the components to that application, but those could potentially be used by the Leisure app and so on. Let's say I didn't make this layer, so these components resided in the actual Blazor WebAssembly application, then I would reference one Blazor WebAssembly application into another Blazor WebAssembly application. That's not really ideal. So I think I did the full explanation without that actually being the purpose of the video. Anyway, all that is left for me to do now is make sure these HTTP calls happen to the auth API and they get a JWT token back that gets stored in the local storage and so forth, and with which they can then authenticate, access other resources in these APIs. I'll probably make other videos about that because I'll then have a HTTP client that accesses a specific API, but also an HTTP client that accesses the auth API. So that's probably going to be with named clients, named HTTP clients in Blazor WebAssembly, and I'll definitely make a video about that, but that's a work in progress. And I'm very tempted right now to make a utils shared SPA to a Razor class library that holds all the components related to authentication and maybe also transactions or something. Who knows? See you in the next video. Of course, previous drawing didn't contain all elements. This one still doesn't contain all elements because there's yet another underscore shared few projects with underscore shared, but that's not important for the drawing right now. These are, so I added these shared SPAs because these contain components, the reusable components that I use, for example, through both in the Adopt app as in the Leisure app, or these contain the components that I can use in the Leisure app, and the Pet Social app, and the Belgian Dogos app. And they already they have the HTTP call built in. So, so this would be a more accurate representation.